No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, as men, we tend, as you alluded to shove our emotions down before it bubbles up and boils up in a, in a terrible way down the line, right?
Warning that this episode may contain a conversation related to suicide. If you are having thoughts of suicide, please dial the suicide hotline at 988. Mustaches and men's health. Max Skinner, the Community Development Manager for Movember, shares just exactly how they help tackle men's health issues such as prostate cancer, testicular cancer, and issues related to suicide. So, let's do it.
Too many days in the darkness without a glimpse of the light. Running tired and broken and scared, but I swear I'll never give up the fight. I see you broken and beat, head pulled down over your eyes. Every part of you wants to surrender, but darling, you were meant to survive. With every star.
Max, thanks for coming on today, man.
Dan, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I was trying to describe Movember to someone the other day because I was so excited to do this podcast with you, and it turned into just like me doing like a 5 minute long-winded response to them, asking me what Movember is, and I was like, you know what, just take mustache and men's health, morph them together, and then I was just like, just listen to the podcast. Max is coming on from
Boom.
Movember, and he'll do a great job over telling you guys, really what it is you guys do, what issues you guys really tackle. So I'd love to just do a deep dive into
Totally. I mean, you nailed it with the mustache and the men's health. That's a great,
that.
great synopsis on what we're all about. No, it's funny that the mustache is kind of our, our recognizable token, if you will. But obviously, Movember goes way deeper than that. We are the leading charity for men's health on a global scale. So, what does that mean exactly? Well, we focus on three critical cause categories, including prostate cancer, testicular cancer, and most recently, mental health and suicide prevention in young men. The funds that we raise, people get a little confused because we are technically a registered 501(c)(3) charity, but we don't necessarily have any in-house programs or research or anything like that in-house. The funds that we raise here are used to support research and programs that basically enable men to live happier, healthier, and longer lives. And I'll get into that a little bit later in terms of the specific programs that we support. But I do want to touch on the history and kind of the origins of Movember because it's super fascinating. We are a global operation. We have an office in Melbourne, Australia, which is where our headquarters are, which is where Movember first started. We have an office in London, Los Angeles, where I'm based,
That's
as well
awesome. You guys are worldwide.
worldwide, man. Yeah, we're trying to support men across the globe, and so it started off by a group of four guys in Melbourne, Australia. These guys had a mustache. They were just having a beer at this bar called the Gypsy Bar in Melbourne, and after a few beers, they got to talking because this was back in 2003. I think the mustache was kind of out of style at the time. And they were like, you know what, we need to bring this back as a fashion trend. And we want to support, more men's health programs and generate awareness for men because at the time they were inspired by a friend's mother who was raising money for breast cancer awareness. And they felt like men's health wasn't getting the same attention that some of these other categories were getting year round with, breast cancer awareness in October, mental health awareness in May and September. And, they felt like men's health programs weren't getting as much attention as some of these other causes. And so the story goes, this guy, Travis Garone and Luke Slatery, which are two of our four founders, they convinced about 30 of their friends to also grow out their mustaches that November and make the campaign about prostate cancer because one of their fathers was going through prostate cancer at the time.
You said 30 friends?
30 friends.
That's got
Yeah.
some good influence.
I know, right? So that's where it started. 2003, 30 friends in Australia got together, and they grew out their mustaches, and it was for them, they didn't raise much money that first year, but they were astounded by how much awareness and conversation their mustaches drew and generated for prostate cancer, which was pretty cool. Like the mustache, as we talked about, is such a good conversation starter. No matter how crappy of a mustache you grow, people take notice. And as much as our wives or spouses don't appreciate the mustache as much, it really is a good conversation starter. And so they kind of use that as their catalyst and their springboard to launching this larger campaign. So anyways, after kind of building up some momentum the following year, they ended up partnering with the Prostate Cancer Foundation in New Zealand, and then they registered Movember as an official foundation and charity in 2006, a few years later. So from there, the rest is kind of history. Since they launched in 2003, Movember has raised over $830 million for men's health
Oh, wow.
programs. They've funded over 1,200 programs over the last, however long that is, 19 years, in about 20 countries across the globe. So as you can see, what started off as kind of a gag type of campaign has turned into something that has benefited and impacted a lot of people along the way. So that's kind of the origins and the history behind Movember and what we're all about.
I love that it's worldwide too, because that fits right with my podcast. On the podcast like definition, it says it's your worldly podcast, and we start off in Australia, which I didn't even know actually myself, and I've done a lot of research on you guys too. That I love that because you go from Australia, Europe, United States. I view you guys as almost more United States than anything because I'm just used to you guys. But that's awesome. You guys extend all the way down there, and November is probably just your absolute month.
Oh yeah, no doubt. That's where about 90% of our fundraising takes place throughout the month of November. We've kind of coined the whole month as, Men's Health Month, if you will. And it's around the holidays. People are feeling a little more charitable at the end of the year. You've got Giving Tuesday, normally at the end of November most years, which it is this year, thankfully. So yeah, that's where the bulk of our fundraising goes. We are trying to kind of expand our fundraising arm beyond just the month of November, make it a little more year round, especially considering that we recently supported suicide prevention and mental health, which, as I'm sure there's a couple awareness months sprinkled out throughout the year. I think it's May and September. And so we're trying to shift our focus to other awareness months as well. But yeah, November is it's coming up, and that's our bread and butter, baby.
Yeah. That's I'm glad that you guys added suicide too, because I know prostate cancer and testicular cancer you said were the pretty much like the foundations, and then you guys picked up suicide along the way to kind of make it also a men's issue too, which I think is great because it's not talked about as much, and start using that as a issue to try to start tackling.
100%. And I mean, you touched on it. Ultimately, we want to support men's health, across the board. There's kind of an alarming statistic that we always tell our fundraisers: men are dying 6 years earlier than women on average, and these are mostly for preventable reasons. For example, prostate cancer. I believe it's 1 in 8 men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer at some point in their lives. Testicular cancer, obviously, that's the most common cancer in young men. And then suicide, as we've talked about briefly, Dan, has certainly picked up over the past couple of years. I think the whole, isolation piece of COVID has really put people in a dark spot. And as a result, the suicide rate numbers are through the roof. 4 out of the 5 suicides in the US are by men. Each year, we lose about 37,000 men to suicide in the US. So as you can see, those numbers are alarming.
It's
They're
insane.
only increasing. So there's so much more work that we need to be done, or that needs to be done. And so, suicide, as you touched on, that being one of our core, or key focus areas. we recently introduced that initiative about, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago at Movember. And people always ask us, like, what are you guys doing about suicide in particular? Like, what specifically are you supporting? Ultimately, our goal is to kind of help, transform how men think about their health and act on it, right? And so we use the funds that we raise, by our amazing community members. We collaborate with some of the sharpest minds in the world, some of the best researchers in the world to create more, effective treatments and solutions, make programs and resources just, more readily accessible for men. For example, we actually teamed up with the Prevention Institute to help, men and young boys of color, as well as military service and veterans in more rural, urban areas, get the support that they need for their mental well-being. Whether that's through, different programs, webinars, just easier access for some of these programs, right? Um,
Do you,
true. No, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
do you think that there's, because though every time I think about men facing their mental health problems and so, or even just stress alone, I always think, and I'm guilty of it myself, of emotion avoidance, procrastination, the I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Because you always think too, it's always something you can do, right? It's always something you can face later. You're pushing this conflict within yourself or with, in a relationship off and just kicking the rock down the road, really. And I know that's not the way to do it, but I'm even thinking about how many programs and things that are out there. And I envision it's almost like, have you ever seen the movie Dumb and Dumber, where Jim
Oh yeah.
Carrey at the end, where like this bus of beautiful women in bikinis are asking them to like put oil on them. They go, oh, well, there's a bunch of guys actually down the road that can do it better. I feel like men would just walk right past like a mental health clinic that are screaming at them, going, if you need help, if you have stress in your life, please come in now. It's free. You can speak with anybody, and we are just going to keep walking past it. And
Yes.
I think about that. I'm like, if that might be the starting point where we're at. I'm like, how do we can we fix that too? Because I'm thinking that might be like that might be step one. Because how many times have we had somebody, a friend or a girlfriend, spouse, anybody say to us like, "What's the problem? What's the problem?" You're like, "There's no problem."
Totally, man. No, no, you nailed it. And I think we're gonna have to use that analogy from Dumb and Dumber and turn that into a meme or something, just to generate some awareness about some of these programs. No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, as men, we tend, as you alluded to shove our emotions down before it bubbles up and boils up in a in a terrible way down the line, right? I think one thing that we want our audience to know about mental health is that it's okay not to be okay. And that's, that you hear that a lot, and it's easier said than done. But the best way, in my opinion, to take action is by opening it up, because talking, having conversations like this, putting our mission and our cause out there in the cloud through these podcasts, talking really honestly saves lives. I've seen it firsthand throughout my life. I've been personally touched by suicide in my life. I lost my mother 8 years ago to suicide. I've lost a couple fraternity brothers over the past few years to
Oh, geez, I'm
suicide.
sorry to hear that.
Thanks, and yeah, it's again one of those life situations that you just got to turn something horrible into something positive, which is part of the reason I'm so drawn to the Movember cause, and especially now that we're focused on on mental health. Um, but even back then, like when my mom took her own life, this was 8 years ago. She didn't necessarily have some of these resources and programs at her disposal, and you've seen this kind of shift over the past 3 to 5 years of suicide and depression and anxiety becoming a little more universally acceptable to talk about, which is fantastic. Like that's where we need to start. Just talking about it, talking freely about it, owning up to our emotions, becoming vulnerable. That's, in my opinion, the best way that we can generate impact and help people, because we all go through shit in our lives, right? Everyone's got skeletons in their closet. Everyone's bogged down by, everyday life. People are depressed. We're anxious. There's a lot going on in the world right now, a lot of global issues, a freaking pandemic, the market crash, everyone's tightening their belts. So there's a lot going on. and just kind of owning up to that, recognizing that it's okay that, you're stressed out by all these global issues that are happening. I think that's the first step. There's one program uh called ALEC. These are like simple steps to remember as men. Ask, listen, encourage action, and check in. ALEC. Ask, listen, encourage action, check in. Those are four great steps to live by as we're having conversations with our friends and fathers and partners who might be struggling. So, anyways, to answer
I
your
like
question,
that.
I
Yeah.
think having a conversation is really key in impacting change.
I think almost too, just being so direct and almost like sarcastically, like making fun of yourself too is also a good way too. Where like you brought up the market crashing. I mean, there's been times you look at your investment account, and it's like, oh man, this is looking a little grim. But just saying it out loud, like, oh man, I'm down 60%. It's a that just like
Right.
starts that conversation. You make fun of yourself almost, and it kind of puts you in a good light because you've said it out loud, and that's a good starting point to then like readdress um everything else, where you're almost
Yeah.
like not even making fun of yourself, you're making fun of the situation. So you're like downgrading the situation almost, which then like you don't feel as flooded and drowning within what is happening. I found that works, that's worked the best, and just being direct and quick. Like that when that thought comes to mind, not being so like instinctual, but also too still catering to that where it's like, just say it out loud. Just say it out loud. It's better to
Oh
get it
yeah.
out maybe and then deal with the consequences of maybe it being said, but then at least it's out of your system. Because I spoke with an intimacy coach last week who I'm good friends with, and she's always talking about she does great work. Most of her clients are men who she tries to help their mental health. And when they come to her, all of a sudden the floodgates are open. And
Oh yeah.
she talks a lot of the time about your spiritual health too, and how that affects your actual physical health. And there's been a lot of times where she has said, a lot of times people who end up getting sick at a young age or having whether it's cancer, disease, or something weird just happens that you wouldn't think, oh well, they've been healthy and living a healthy life. Sometimes in those cases, that person has suffered trauma, severe trauma in their younger, earlier days. And her sort of thought is that that person has never been able to release that trauma verbally and get it out in the open. And she seems to think that a lot of cases it's that person holding on to that so long, that toxic almost waste in their body, to where it's got to go someplace. And all of a sudden that person who's 20, 27 years old has a tumor growing in their side or something. And when she had said
Yeah.
that, it made so much sense because a lot of her clients, she said, have had either tumors or cancers or something, to where that trauma was so built up over the course of years. And I think about men, and I think about them doing that for a lot of their life. And then when you look at that life expectancy, it's not surprising that it's
Yeah.
lower than women. When women tend to just express themselves, I feel more freely and openly and more in a healthier manner.
Yeah, and let that be a lesson to us. I mean, I think the intimacy coach absolutely nailed it. I mean, stress plays a major role in our life, especially like post-traumatic stress disorder. I experienced that firsthand after I lost my mother. Unfortunately, I was the one to discover her after she took her own life. And as you can imagine, for a 21-year-old kid, like completely turned my world upside down. And I was kind of, left to pick up the pieces where I had every excuse in the book to, sit in my pity party,
Yeah,
sulk and use that as an
it's so
excuse
easy to stay
to
there
not do
too.
anything. Right, and totally, but I didn't wanna end up like my mom did, and I wanted other people to kinda learn from that experience, and immediately, I tried to turn that horrible experience into something positive. Granted, the first few years after she passed, needless to say, I struggled. I abused drugs, I had anxiety, I had like, severe panic attacks, as anyone would, right? And then I just woke up one day and said, "I cannot live my life like this," kinda picked myself up out of my bootstraps and committed to living a healthier life, working out more, stopped doing drugs, did a lot of meditation, and then obviously support from my friends and family certainly helped along the way. And even like getting involved with a community, like my first exposure to nonprofit fundraising came in about 2015. This was about 2 years after my mom had passed. Um, I wanted to, I wanted to get involved in suicide prevention to kind of share my story that, my experience that I went through with my mom, but I didn't necessarily know where to look. Did a little research online. This was when I was living in Boston at the time and found this great organization called Samaritans that does amazing work for suicide prevention in New England. Ended up like running one of their 5Ks one year. And that first year running the 5K, like crossing that finish line, I was just filled with so much emotion looking around, seeing other people crying because I felt like I was part of a community that like understood my pain and didn't judge me for it. Right. And I took that experience and kind of used that as my springboard into the nonprofit space and just how rewarding and fulfilling uh, giving back to a cause that I was passionate about. I mean, that's what Movember is all about. That's what nonprofit fundraising is all about. Like, I think everyone in our lives is kind of seeking that sense of purpose and fulfillment, right? And that's why I'm honored to be part of Movember. And but anyways, yeah, man, it starts with having a conversation, being vulnerable like I have been, and it's really helped me process and grieve over the years. So that's what it's all about.
I mean, that's amazing stuff that you were able to turn that into something great, because that's such a I mean, I couldn't even imagine being at that age and going through some of those experiences, and how easy it is to just, fall into a different track, a different road, and just take what your kind of body wants to naturally gravitate to after experiencing one of those traumatic experiences. I mean, it's so much harder to kind of do what you did, and then, like you said, that utopian feeling you felt after that marathon. I mean, that to feel great, you feel I it sounds like you feel purposeful, which is, I think, what
Yeah.
sometimes is missing, and maybe leading to some of the causes of these suicide and things like that. I had and I brought up PTSD too, which reminded me of an experience I had in when I was back in the Army National Guard. I had gone to training for about our 2 week training during the summer with my one of my friends, who I won't name his name, but we went to that 2 week training. We come back from Indiana. It's our next training is in 2 weeks, right? We all go home. I'd spent 2 full weeks with him. So you get close because you're not only training with that person, you're sleeping next to him, and 24/7 for 2 straight weeks. And he
Yeah.
was my good friend before that too in the unit. But then we get back. I'm supposed to see him again in 2 weeks later for another set of training. And all of a sudden, um, you know, the text messages throughout the unit start going crazy that he ended up taking his own life. And
Mm,
it was really weird for me because I had just saw him. I had just
yeah.
saw him, spent all this time with him. So I was just weirded out that, like, all of a sudden somebody's just right there, and then the next second they're not. It's kind of your brain is somehow trying to interpret really what's going on. And it was a mess of an event, because it was also a rarity in suicide, where it was a
Yeah.
suicide by cop too, which was really weird. And what
Mm,
made it even rarer in that regard is that, a lot of suicide by cops, I say 99.9% of the time, are done by, an ex-convict robbing a bank who's saying, "I'm not going back to jail." This wasn't my friend. He wasn't, that wasn't the scenario he had faced. And that was the route that ended up occurring there, unfortunately. And it was, a combination of a lot of things, domestically and things. But I uh I knew for a fact, though, from doing a little bit more research, that this was not the result of a one day encounter that he fell into, or just like a really bad day he had. I mean, that what he did, he did due to a much longer term struggle with something over the course of time that added up
mhm.
and had finally reached cognitive overload in a negative way, like the perfect storm or the imperfect storm, I should say, that led to just those events happening. And then, the aftermath of that, I really learned why this is still a huge issue. And I feel like we're still in the infancy stages of solving it, because
Yeah.
the unit, let's go fast forward a month, the next drilling session, where about 125 grown men between 19 and 45 are in a room together talking about, obviously, this soldier of ours who took his own life, who was, lived 5 minutes down the road. And that was the big topic of conversation then. And this was so, I'd say, I get the intention, but it was so misguided. Our main leader of the troop has us all in the same room, right? And imagine yourself being a man and being in this position. He's talking about suicide and how it's such a big thing in the military right now. And he says, "Please, guys, raise your hand right now if you are considering suicide." And, like, in a room like that, when it's only men, it's only testosterone. And when you're around other men with no women, your testosterone is through the roof. And
Oh,
then what
yeah.
he's asking us to do is to remove our testosterone and open ourselves up. And I'm just like sitting there, just like so angry inside, because I'm like, this guy is, I get the intention, but he has no idea what he is what he's doing right now with asking this out loud, thinking. And he's going to go home later that night, I knew, thinking, "Oh, well, my troop's good. It was only that one soldier."
Right.
And I started thinking about, when you had said PTSD before, it brought this thought up that, a lot of the people in the military right now that are committing suicide, because in the military, suicide's a big thing too. A lot of the ones committing suicide are not the ones who fought in Afghanistan, who invaded Iraq, Vietnam. They're the non-combat millennial Gen Zers who are taking their own life. And you got to think to yourself,
Yep.
what's the reason then? Because you can't chalk it up to PTSD. And at that point, we have to then rewind the whole channel to be like, all these people we thought it might have been fully PTSD with, maybe it wasn't entirely that case either. So there's a lot of different
Right.
dynamics to it, and it's very interesting because when younger soldiers started taking their own lives, the real question that the military was facing, and still is that reason of why. Because they say they have the resources, but the thing is, they scream it in your face, here's the resource. Who are you thinking of taking your own life? And it's like, my man, like
That's just
that's not the
not the
approach.
way to go about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a systemic issue to some degree. I mean, there's so many different roots of this problem,
Yeah.
especially in the military world. And I mean, I can't speak to it, as I'm sure you can, but I think the traditional military man, you know, they're perceived as macho, and they have to be very buttoned up and macho and by the book. And it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of shoving your emotions down and not being able to process your emotions in a natural and healthy way, right?
Because it's almost your job to.
Exactly. And so I think that's probably what we're seeing with a lot of younger soldiers who are taking their lives these days, who don't have a lot of combat experience, who don't necessarily have PTSD as not an excuse, but as the factor, right? So I think it's an emotional thing. I think it's a generational shift that we're seeing right now. I hate to blame it on social media, but I think social media plays a part in it as well. Everyone's judging themselves. Everyone feels kind of confined to their phones, the immediacy of it all. Like, there's really no removing yourself from judgment anymore. Like, you know what I mean?
No.
It's kind of bananas. But I guess I'd love to ask you a question in this regard. Like, when your buddy took his own life, I would imagine that left you with some lingering questions and some guilt, right? Because at least it did for me.
I mean, you really start to, your mind immediately goes back to, when's the last time I saw that person? How did it go?
Yeah.
Is like the immediate thought. And you always think about, well, what could have been said, what could have been done. And I mean, he fit the perfect bill for that, you know, emotionally hidden man. And we had a great time in training. You complained, you had fun. It was it really there weren't really any signs. And when he ended up taking his life, I just I mean, he was it ended up coming out that, I mean, he was dealing with something that was, I mean, really would be life altering
Mm,
within his own relationship with that I think would really strike anybody very hard, especially a man. And I almost I don't want to say I sadly kind of understood the what he did, but I understood the cognitive overload that he was experiencing. And then when I
mm,
thought about that exact time, setting, place, and people he was around, I that's when I kind of understood um like how it ended up unfolding the way that it did, because it was really just like, I mean, you had to have the exact pieces all together all at the same time. and it ended up going that way, unfortunately. But I mean, I think back,
yeah.
and I mean, I didn't have any conversations where we were talking deeply and I could have asked him something. I decided not to. Like, there really wasn't any of those moments, I would say, because it just, and then when it happened, it really shocked. But the biggest, most saddest thing is that nothing changed. You know? I mean, nothing
Yeah.
changed. That's the most saddest part I could say. I mean, the unit was still the same. People still held in their emotions. I mean, I'd say even more so. And things things just were just the same. And I think at that moment too, when one of your buddies has killed themselves, there there needs to be a demand of communication,
Yeah.
because during a death, especially somebody so young, there is a tremendous amount of feelings that everyone's feeling. And when no one is talking like that, there needs to be a demand, like a command that no one's leaving until there's communication done that is the average person can reasonably say, yeah, that person let out all the emotions because of the way their body language was, their tone, their demeanor, the way they were talking, the way um their facial expressions. Maybe they cried, and then you can really, okay, that person communicated.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way to do it. I mean, that really is, because that's the saddest thing. I realize it now that nothing changed from it.
Well, and that's the toughest part because it leaves so many lingering questions, and I think it's pretty natural to kind of second guess, did I say the right thing? Could I have done more in those situations? And kind of piggybacking off of your point, I had a fraternity brother that took his own life about 5 years ago. Came from a super Irish Catholic family, which, as you can imagine, was fairly shocking to them. Kind of same thing though. They were very hush hush about the whole situation. Our friend group wasn't really able to process and grieve as naturally as I think we should have. And then after the fact, after I got involved with suicide prevention in Boston, I reached out to this family to see, if they wanted to get involved because it was such a great way for me to process, right? And I think it was the Irish Catholic in them, like they kind of
Mm,
swept it under the rug, went without saying. They were almost ashamed by it to some degree. And that's also part of the problem, not to loop religion into this, but it just stems back to people not feeling comfortable being
yeah.
vulnerable, sharing their emotions, wearing their emotions on their sleeve, and yeah, something needs to change. I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself. I can honestly, genuinely, because I'm a very self-reflecting person. I'm always reflecting on, almost to a bad degree, where it's like I'm reflecting on that phone call I had in like sixth grade that was like embarrassing or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
I'm
I'm
the
always
same
I'm
way.
I'm always like reflecting. I can honestly say that I do have good mental health, and then I feel healthy in that way, especially because, considering I've been in different places where I know where I wasn't, and then I know where I have been, and I can say right now I definitely have been. It's very easy to fall off that wagon. But I can also say there's a reason why I am that way right now, and it's because I mean I really do. I feel like express myself, express what I'm feeling to people. I call up family, I call up friends, and I have a lot of different types of friends. I have friends that I can go to for like if it's something like relationship wise, I can go to them and they're like the relationship friend. I have somebody to go to if it's something else, if it's money, if it's I'm having a bad family problem. Like I have different outlets for everything. So it's also having a good web of people in your network because I or not in your network in your circle. Um
Yeah.
but I'd say just as important it is that pick up the phone and call because I mean I call my parents almost basically once a day. I'm always chatting and that's when things come up and you can share it right before it starts to really gain traction into becoming more of an issue. And
Yeah.
even a buddy from high school just called me last night, and he I talk to him maybe once every 2 to 3 weeks, and we just call each other and chat. I'm always, I mean, whether it's on, I'm a gamer, so I play Xbox. I'm talking with some buddies there too, and it's always just sharing. Whenever you, I would say, if you're listening to this right now, and not only if you're a guy, but like if you're anybody and you are feeling something and you want to say it, you should say it. Especially if it's in regards to how you feel or your feelings. Because I feel like it's not going to go anywhere if you keep it inside, except just turn into a health problem for you. And then,
It's gonna yeah.
yeah, you go. Sorry.
I was gonna say it's gonna bubble up in an unhealthy way at, some point down the line, and I I love that you're so active in communication with your friends. I think that's so important, and one thing that I personally need to work on is just picking up the phone and calling my buddies. I mean, we text and we kinda hide behind our phones a little bit through texting, which is fairly natural, but there's something to be said about hearing your friend's voice. They can pick up on your voice and body language, whatever it may be. I love that. I think ultimately as men, especially our generation, like we need to pick up the phone more and just call our friends and family. Like at the end of the day, that's probably the healthiest way to go about it. That's a great stepping stone, you know?
Yeah, 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 and it isn't even like I mean, people think that I don't want to say they think it's girly to like pick up the phone and call people too, but like there's ways you can go about it too. Where like some of my like guy friends, like I'll call them up and I'll just be like, "What's going on, you piece of shit?" Like, or you sack of
Yes.
garbage. Like it's you're just bullshit, and that's awesome. And I would say if somebody who's having problems communicating with anybody right now, or holding some stuff in, just there's some rules to just keep yourself to. Like number one, if you are in traffic for longer than 10 or more minutes, just call someone. What else are you gonna do? You're just
Yes.
blaring like some absurdity on the radio. Or I mean, maybe you're listening to your favorite podcast, no politics over here. But like
Nice
just
plug.
yeah, pick up the phone call. I used to do that all the time on my commute to the city or when I was working in Jersey at the time, or even when I'm cooking, like I'll just call somebody up because I'm focused. I'm not doing anything else except cooking with my hands. So let me just talk to somebody. And sometimes I've gotten the stop with all those clicking in pans and so but it keeps you communicated way better than social media
Yeah.
ever will. So that's a rule. If you go on a walk or run, that's always something to kind of keep in mind.
Love that. Finding those little windows during your daily life where you can connect with people that are close to you. I think that's super important. And or even during those windows, man, like even on a commute, rather than blasting music or blasting no politics, which is a phenomenal option.
Yeah.
Um, you could use that time to self-reflect, do a little meditation. Like I think taking 5 minutes out of each day is so important for us just to stay in tune with our bodies and our souls. But for some reason, it's so hard to set aside like even 2 minutes set aside to focus on breathing and breath work. Like that's the best way to stay grounded and to look up at, every once in a while, look up at the trees, look up at the sky. just remind yourself why you're here, put your feet in the ground. Those little moments of self-reflection are incredibly important as well. So just wanted to call that out as well.
Yeah, no, it is. It is, especially I mean, just doing a meditation, which I just started last year. Doing one every long once in a while. I'm not a meditation guru, but the times that I did it, I could I can understand why people gravitate it so much. Like the people who do it for a living and rely on it. Like I really do understand it, even if it's just 10 minutes, just doing a meditation because you're distancing yourself from all the distractions in the world. And you think about it, just for 5 or 10 minutes, it helps you. Like, could you imagine if we didn't have a lot of that stuff in the world, how much people's like mental health would be
Oh
just
my God.
through the
And
roof?
we waste so much time just scrolling mindlessly on social media and
Yeah.
like doing stupid shit. I actually, since I moved to LA, um, my buddy who I grew up with has been dragging me to these he's a big yogi. He's like big into that space. He's been dragging me to these group meditation classes that last like 3 hours, and they're always led by really interesting folks. Like this one guy was a recovering heroin addict, and he said like breath work and meditation saved his life from being an addict. And these sessions are super intense, man. Like it's like 2 straight hours of like intense breath work, breathing through the mouth.
Yeah.
And the first session I did, like no joke, I felt like it was an out of body experience. Like I was levitating, like watching my body on the mat, and people around me are screaming, they're crying, like they encourage you to go back to your most traumatic experience in your life. So as you can imagine, really intense. But after that session, I felt like a different person. Like I was so grounded, so in tune with myself. I felt like I could breathe again to a certain degree. And so that was completely out of my comfort zone. I encourage folks that are listening to go out of your comfort zone. Even if you feel like you're not a yogi, you're not a meditator, give it a shot because you'll be surprised how freaking grounding and beautiful it is.
Yeah, no, that's awesome stuff. And anything that's that 2 hour type of sessions, man, those are really, really, really good.
Yeah, man.
They're deep.
Super deep, a little intense, but honestly, like it's kind of life changing for a lot of people.
Yeah. No, no, that's amazing stuff. Because I know a lot of people who are starting to like kind of run those classes and teachers that do that kind of stuff, and those people themselves are so just open. They're happy. You could tell there's just that forever glow about
Yeah,
their personality.
I know. I'm
Um,
envious.
I know, I know. Where where can people more importantly, where can people find you? Because I know it's Movember time. It's time to get things going. Let's start growing out those mustaches, facial hair, and seeing ways we can help and make this a priority.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's time to start growing. I would say the best way to support Movember is just to sign up now at our website, which is just movember.com. Start a fundraiser if you're passionate about any of the causes that we represent. It's one of the most rewarding experiences raising money for a cause that you care about. But there are a few other ways that you can support Movember beyond just fundraising. You can obviously grow out a mustache throughout the month of November. It's a great conversation starter, as we talked about, great awareness piece. You can move for Movember, which is kind of a new endurance strategy that we just rolled out this year. Basically, we're encouraging our fundraisers to walk or run 60 miles for the 60 men that we lose to suicide every hour around the world. And then the last piece, you can mow your own way, which is kind of another way of saying you can support Movember any way you want, however you want, whether it's hosting an event, hosting a shave down, like shaving your beard live on Instagram, giving up a bad habit for the month of November. However you feel like you're bettering yourself and generating impact and awareness, run with it. And then the last piece, you can obviously just make a donation at Movember.com. We obviously appreciate all the support. So yeah, those are really the ways that you can get involved, and just sign up on Movember.com.
Okay, good stuff. How many people did you say? You said what you could walk 60. What was it?
Walker runs 60 miles for the 60 men that we lose to suicide every
Okay.
hour around the world.
Okay. Okay. Wow,
Yeah,
that's around the world too. Jeez. Yeah, because a lot
I
of times
know. I
we
mean,
think about
it
just the
doesn't
United States, but then this is obviously happening in all over the place.
totally. And it doesn't have to be running or walking. Like last year, folks did 60 push-ups and they would ask for $60 for donations for every push-up they did or burpees or whatever it may be. However you feel like you're contributing, there's so many different unique ways you can use to fundraise. So anyways, appreciate all the support.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. And I'll finish up with just a quote about how to view Movember too, with this month. And it's a quote right from your website from a very kind gentleman named Max Skinner. It's
Wow.
I tr- I try to get my friends and family to understand that Movember isn't just 30 days of taking care of our health. It's a starting line to changing it forever. And I think that viewing it as a starting line is such a great approach because it's kind of like how we view January 1st each year. It's like it's a fresh start. It's time for me to do this. You start getting your goals together. Like when, you know, November 1st, like that is a very, very good time to start outlining the goals, especially where you're so close to the end of the year at that point that it's very fair to just be like, oh, if I want to do this, let me just do it for 2 months, and then come new January 1st, if it hasn't worked out, I'll change my goals for the new year. But I love that you had said that because it's a very good starting line. I love those two words, starting line, because it gives people a chance to be like, hey, all right, maybe once a week I'm just gonna share my thoughts, my feelings, or if something comes up. So thanks for that line, Max. If I'm glad I could share that with everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks for pulling that. I think that's an important way to cap off this conversation because kind of stemming back to what we discussed earlier in the podcast in terms of expanding our fundraising arm beyond just the month of November, men in general need to work on their health beyond just 1 month out of the year, right? It's a starting line to the rest of your life, in my opinion. So I appreciate you calling that out. I appreciate you supporting us and generating awareness for Movember and our whole mission. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on this, Dan.
Yeah, no problem, Max. The pleasure is mine, and I'm sure I'll see you guys down the road, especially in November.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for all the support. We'll see you next month.
All right, sounds good, man.
Every star